Once in your life, if you are lucky, you will experience a profound moment that lights a fire in your soul for the rest of your days. And this spark will ignite a movement so bold that the effects will ripple long after you have taken your last breath. For this moment drove you into the need and desire to take everything that you have and expand it, and then provide it to anyone who will ask the question, am I worthy? Mount Washington almost seems like a puppy when you compare it to the big dogs of North America. It is a fraction of the size of the mountains in the Rockies, and yet this mountain changed the course of two men's lives long before they became men. Their upbeat energy gave way to caution and apprehension, and finally a last-ditch effort to survive. And as death swallowed the mountain, these two clung to their ability to make it through. And in the final moments, as they accepted defeat, an angel came to their door. Welcome back to Tragedy with a View. I am your host, Kayla.
And I'm Sam. And the eagles came to save them, like Frodo and Sam. I mean, I guess I'll find out who saved them, but that's my first guess. For all the Lord of the Rings fans, as Kayla looks at me with bewilderment.
I don't know how to verbalize the fact that this went over my head other than saying that went over my head. But I knew as soon as you said Frodo, I was like, oh, this is Lord of the Rings. And I know nothing about Lord of the Rings.
People
Frodo,
in the comments will tell us.
Frodo and a ring. And is it Gandalf?
Gandalf is the wizard.
Okay, I know 3 things.
Sam and Frodo are stuck on the mountain and then get rescued by huge eagles at the end of the show after they destroy the ring.
There's a helicopter. Does that count as an eagle?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, we can really make it count because it's the, I think, National Guard that comes, which is a branch of the United States Service, correct?
Military, yeah.
And the United States is represented by an eagle.
This is all an allegory for Lord of the Rings.
Okay, so we're actually just talking about a Lord of the Rings movie.
Yep.
I'm just kidding. I do want to mention, though, that I was planning to do this episode in a couple of months, but things kind of got...
Lucky you guys.
Things got rearranged, and I'm just going to tell you about what or who this is about, because if you are super familiar with Mount Washington, you probably already know this story. We are going to be talking about Hugh Herr and how his time on the mountain changed his life, literally forever. So one of the reasons why I wanted the buffer was because there's a National Geographic episode about his story, and I wanted to find it so that way I could use it as a reference, but I cannot find it anywhere. I can find clips on YouTube.
Lost to the ravages of time.
Yeah. I don't know where it existed, just not in full anymore to what I can find. So if anybody else is able to find it, it's called Ascent, the Hugh Herr story. If you're able to find it, please let me know, because I'd love to watch it, even though I've already done a lot of research on this. And then also there was a book that I was going to read for this episode, but then I found out the book is no longer in print. And so it's $103 on Amazon, and I'm just not willing to pay that. So I had a cushion to watch the movie, read the book, and since those two got wiped out and I needed an episode for this week, here we are. And Sam knows nothing about this.
I have been intentionally left in the dark And that's why I had to guess the Eagles saved them.
Yeah. I mean, I told you.
I had a one-word hint.
Yeah.
Innovation.
Innovation, which it relates. We'll get how.
I'll be the judge of that.
So, as we already mentioned, we're going to Mount Washington, which is not actually in White Mountains National Forest, but we're going to talk a little bit about White Mountains National Forest because it surrounds the mountain. So, White Mountains National Forest was established in 1918, and most of the land in the state of New Hampshire, it resides mostly in the lands of the state of New Hampshire in eastern United States, with a small portion of it laying in the state of Maine. More than 100 miles or 161 kilometers of the Appalachian Trail is within the White Mountain National Forest, and 6 designated federal wilderness areas exist within the forest. And these include Presidential Range or Dry River Wilderness Area, Great Gulf Wilderness Area, the Pemigewasset Wilderness Area, Sandwich Range Wilderness Area, Caribou or Speckled Mountain Wilderness Range, and the Wind River Wilderness Area.
What is the difference between a wilderness area and a park?
These areas are protected from logging and commercial industries and are used solely for recreation and scientific purposes. So you can't have any sort of motorized vehicles or motorized bikes going through the area. For example, Zion has a highway that runs through it. That highway is not designated wilderness area. So much like Zion, the White Mountains National Forest has a lot of roads and a lot of highways that go through it. And in order to protect other areas of land, they have these designated wilderness areas that you pretty much cannot touch unless you're on your own 2 feet.
So wilderness areas are inside of parks or outside of parks?
They're inside of parks.
Okay.
I mean, it's a designated wilderness area, so they can be outside of parks as well, but I think it's easier for them to regulate that if it's within a park.
I see.
The wildlife in this forest include bald eagles, raccoons, beaver, white-tailed deer, moose, black bear, coyote, peregrine falcons, Canadian lynx, river otter, bobcat, gray and red foxes, mink, and porcupine.
Did you say bald eagle at the beginning?
I did.
Well, see, my prediction is intact still.
The most prominent point in White Mountain National Forest includes the Presidential Range, which holds Mount Washington. So, as I already mentioned, Mount Washington doesn't actually sit inside of White Mountain National Forest, but much of the mountain and surrounding area are part of the National Forest. The summit itself and many of the routes to the summit are part of Mount Washington State Park. From the summit of Mount Washington, you can see 5 states, which are New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, New York, and Massachusetts, 2 countries, the United States and Canada, and the Atlantic Ocean.
Did we already mention the height of this mountain?
We are getting there.
I am just predicting where we're going. I do not see the script.
Mount Washington is known for its weather to be some of the most severe on Earth. Because of the shape of the mountain range, for 75 miles or 121 kilometers in either direction, the mountain range sits at an angle where, as storms move from west to east, they enter the outer edges of this mountain range, and then the range tapers in more and more narrow until it reaches the slight opening in which Mount Washington sits. Along with this, Mount Washington sits in the path of 3 major storm routes that pass through the eastern United States, one of which you may be familiar with if you're from the more northern states. It's called the polar vortex.
Storm route. Is that like the equivalent of water currents for weather patterns?
Essentially.
Okay.
So the polar vortex pulls cold and frigid weathered patterns from the north, and this will collide with the other two, one of which moves laterally across about the middle of the United States, and then the third, which is often associated with hurricane paths and patterns, and they pull all of that hot, humid weather up from the Gulf and the equator. So all three of these kind of merge over the presidential range and Mount Washington. In addition to this, Mount Washington is largely the tallest point in the eastern United States, sitting at 6,288 feet or 1,917 meters, and the peaks around it don't even compare. The second tallest mountain is Mount Adams at 5,774 feet or 1,760 meters. This means that as storm systems move into the area, there is nothing to break up the wind or create any sort of buffer. The storms will collide with the mountain completely unhindered. Similarly to how we talked about Drake's Passage in between South America and Antarctica in the ocean. Do you remember?
Yes, I do. It is the shortest location between continents.
Yes. And
600 miles.
Yep. And because it's so much more narrow than anywhere else, all of that water has to accelerate to be able to fit through that area, which is part of the reason why it's so severe.
It is a simple physics problem.
Yep, this is exactly the same way, because the area between the mountain ranges is about 75 miles wide or 120 kilometers wide, and right smack in the middle of it is Mount Washington. The wind and storms, therefore, are forced to accelerate to track through that passage. All of this combines to make Mount Washington one of the worst weather areas in the world. And because of this, the summit of Mount Washington now has a conservatory staffed 24 hours a day, 365 days a year to collect weather data. Some of the severe readings that the
What would they use it for? Just because?
To collect data.
For what?
Weather patterns.
Okay.
Some of the severe readings that the conservatory has recorded includes the wind chill dropping to a negative 109 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 78 degrees Celsius, which is the coldest wind chill ever recorded in the United States history, and the second highest wind speed in the world at 231 miles per hour or 372 kilometers per hour, which was recorded back in April of 1934.
That's like a tornado. Or what's a tornado wind speed?
It's higher than a hurricane.
Dun, dun, dun.
That's the second highest wind speed ever recorded on Earth.
Where's the first?
The first was only... So this recording was only very recently topped by a cyclone off of the coast of Australia, which reached speeds of 253 miles per hour or 407 kilometers per hour.
That is wild.
On average, the mountain sees wind speeds over 75 miles per hour or 121 kilometers per hour over 1/3 of each year, and the average daily temperature is 27 degrees Fahrenheit or about 3 degrees Celsius. Since 1894, more than 160 people have lost their lives on Mount Washington, and most of these were due to hypothermia.
Is that a lot in comparison to like other, do you know?
Considering the fact that it is a very small mountain and most of them are due to hypothermia, it's just making a note about how cold it is and how harsh it can be.
Yeah, context, that's all.
I mean, what are you supposed to compare that to?
I don't know, people that die on Mount McKinley or something.
Mount McKinley is a completely... I mean,
I know. I don't know how many people die on mountains normally. That's all.
Well, I mean, McKinley is like 4 times the size of Mount Washington.
Okay.
And it's much more secluded. I mean, it's hard to have like a comparison factor like that. Hugh Herr was born on October 25th, 1964, and as he grew, his parents and 4 other siblings would take 3-month-long road trips during the summers, exploring and hiking and fishing. The hiking would turn into backpacking and climbing, and those walls would become more and more vertical. Hugh started climbing at the age of 7 and pretty immediately started trying to climb every day. From the ages of 8 to 13, he would beg others and hitch rides to climbing locations, and eventually he and his 2 brothers began to ice climb. Before he turned 10, he had climbed the face of Mount Temple in the Canadian Rockies, which sits 11,627 feet tall, or 3,544 meters tall. And he is likely the first rock climbing child prodigy.
What? Sorry, I missed the year of this. How old is he? Like, what year is this? 2000s?
He was born in 1964.
Okay.
Prior to him turning 10. So it was
Gotcha.
like late 60s, early 70s. Hugh was naturally gifted, and by the time he was 17, he had become noticed and recognized as one of the best climbers in the United States. He had no interest in furthering his education with college, and as he was in his junior year in high school, he had his eyes set only on ice and rocks. Hugh, again, who was 17 years old, and his climbing partner, Jeff Batzer, who was 20, set out to climb Huntington Ravine and Odell Gully on Mount Washington. Huntington Ravine has several winter climbing fatalities due to it being the most technical and difficult route on Mount Washington, but also because of the hazardous weather Mount Washington gets in the winter months. On January 2nd of 1982, the weather wasn't super great on the mountain, but it wasn't violent by any means. So Jeff and Hugh decided they would go for their intended climb. The 2 hiked a 3-mile trail to Harvard Cabin, which is a small 2-room cabin that also has some campsites on it. And these campsites sit just below Huntington Ravine. Because they were intending to climb this ravine, the boys stayed at Harvard Cabin, and the following morning they climbed the ravine. Next, they moved on to Odell's Gully, which is roughly 1,017 feet or 310 meters long and full of ice. Hugh free soloed the climb, which means that he climbed without ropes to anchor him in the event of a fall, and Jeff followed him. And once they reached the top of the gully, about 90 minutes later, they were about 500 meters from the summit, or just over a quarter of a mile away. The climb was overall very uneventful and completely manageable for the 2 climbers, and at this point, the weather was deteriorating, but hadn't taken a huge turn for the worst. Jeff threw out the idea of taking a quick run up to the summit, and they agreed they would go, but if the weather continued to decline, they would turn around. They left their bag at the top of the gully so that way they would have a marker for where to go, and this bag contained their overnight gear, map, and compass. Within minutes of their ascent to the summit, the weather did take that turn, and Hugh and Jeff found themselves in a whiteout so bad they couldn't determine where they were. They very quickly decided to turn around and head for the ridge, which was their route down from the peak, but the wind was already raging at 100 miles per hour or 161 kilometers per hour, and the wind chill temperature dropped to negative 84 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 64 degrees Celsius.
The fun fact for everyone, so wind chill temperature is calculated by 70% of the wind speed subtracted from the temperature. So if it's 30 miles per hour times 70 is 21 subtracted from the temperature.
Okay. So
maybe.
Maybe.
Confirm before I spread false news. I looked this up 3 years ago.
Yeah, I think we talked about this before.
Let me go Joe Rogan research really fast. Wind chill. I don't want to be spreading false news to our amazing listeners here. Now that I've done my research, the wind chill temperature is actually very complicated according to the National Weather Service, but a good approximation is, as I stated, multiplying the wind speed by 70% and then subtracting it from the air temperature.
Okay, now you know.
Now you know. You heard it here first.
Telling you stories with a little bit of learning in there too. So the wind was so strong that it was nearly blowing the two boys off of their feet every time they took a step. And once they reached the tree line and some form of shelter from the wind, they realized that they weren't on their intended path. So what is theorized happened is that as they descended down the ridge, they started on the right path, but the wind was blowing them so hard that every step they took tracked them more and more to the other side. And once they were there, they had no idea where to go or what to do. What they didn't know was that they had descended into the Great Gulf and they were now on the wilderness side of the mountain, which basically means that the chances of happening upon a trail or a road or other people, especially in January, are very, very small. This area around the mountain is one of those designated wilderness areas in White Mountain National Forest.
So a wilderness area doesn't have trails.
It might have trails, but you cannot take like a bike or a motorized vehicle down the trail.
Okay.
With the thought that down is better than going back up to the summit and trying to find their way, they decided to start moving, which in my opinion is probably the right call because the summit was hovering in some of the coldest temperatures known to the area, and they didn't have any form of shelter that they would be able to get into because they left their bag at the top of the gully when they started up towards the summit.
You know, that makes me wonder how much climbing equipment gets lost because it gets left behind because of bad weather causes you to have to go down a different way. Do you think that that's common?
I know that it's very common for mountaineers and climbers to drop off things that they're not using. Everest is
notorious.
Yeah, especially since it's become commercialized to climb Everest. People will drop empty canisters of oxygen. Even people who have passed on the mountain, they just get left there, and there's not as much of a cleanup effort being done to keep the upper portions of or more technical routes clean because
gotta focus on climbing.
It's harder to get to. It's not like, people walking down a trail that sees some trash. It's not so easy to just pick that stuff up and pack it out. I mean, oxygen canisters are pretty
heavy.
I mean, they're large.
Probably.
And yeah. So anyways, not what this story is about. So as they moved lower, they very quickly found that the snow was extremely deep. It was going to their chest in low areas and even higher in others. The snow was so high that it reached the bottom branches on trees, making travel extremely difficult. However, they found a river that was mostly clear of snow and decided to follow this down the mountain.
Well, actually, with the wind speed, they probably have a huge problem with what is that called? With snow getting blown over areas and then piling up somewhere. Snowdrift?
Drifts.
Snowdrifts? Yeah, they probably have huge problems with snowdrifts.
So the river was covered in what appeared to be a solid sheet of ice, but Hugh unfortunately cracked through the ice not once but twice and fell into knee-deep water. At this time, the temperatures were around negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 29 degrees Celsius, and now his leather boots and pant legs were soaked. As the sky darkened, Hugh and Jeff found a granite boulder that was about the size of a house, and they were able to dig in the snow in a section of it that kind of had the rock formation kind of formed like the back and top of a shelter, and then the snow created the other walls that they needed. They grabbed pine branches and tossed them onto the snow so that way they could be a little bit more insulated from the snow, and then hugged each other and tangled their legs together and begged that their body heat would be enough to make it through the night. And it was. And as they tried to descend, they would do this twice more. In the days that followed, the wind speeds increased to more than 140 miles per hour or 225 kilometers per hour, and Jeff at one point traded his wool pants with Jeff in an attempt to help his legs warm up. However, by their third day, neither of them could walk anymore. Both Hugh and Jeff were hypothermic and they had severe frostbite, and after a long conversation, they decided to no longer try to delay what they felt was the inevitable. And as they huddled in their snow cave, they moved as far away from each other as they could so that way they would no longer have the other's body heat to rely on.
What the? Wait, they just chose to die?
Yes.
Dang.
Yep. So we're going to back up to January 22nd, and I'm also going to apologize because I told you that I would not make you do episodes with me that included people dying.
It's a part of life.
And
I'm just waiting for the Eagles to come.
I got halfway through this one, and then I was like, oh, yeah.
Oh.
Somebody dies. So,
Yeah.
So we're backing up to January 22nd. The Harvard cabin caretaker, Matt Pierce, noticed that Jeff and Hugh hadn't returned to the cabin and decided to report them missing to the Mountain Rescue Service. Joe Lentini got the call in the middle of the night, and by 5 a.m., a search effort was underway. There were 4 teams of 2 men each that were organized, and 3 of these teams started at the bottom of the ravine and Odell's Gully, and then Joe and his partner Brad got into a snowcat and head up higher on the mountain to start from kind of like the end route of that gully.
I have a question. Do you know when park permitting for dangerous quote-unquote areas started?
I think it's always been an on and off thing.
Okay.
Like to climb Denali, you need a permit. You have to go through like the whole like...
Do you know what year that started? Was that like the 90s, 80s?
I think that's been something that's always happened.
Oh.
It's, like in Denali. But some of the parks have more recently done that. So like Angel's Landing, Half Dome, those are like some of the more recent permit lotteries, I guess, that have been put in place. But I don't know about climbing, like rock and ice climbing routes, because there's a very, very specific person that's climbing those. It's not like an attraction for the everyday person that could go and climb like Angel's Landing.
I see.
So Albert Dow and Michael Hartridge were partners during the search, and Albert was an exceptional climber, and he and Michael took to the bottom route, and they were going to work their way up. In the meantime, Joe and Brad reached the tree line, and once they passed this and into the alpine zone, they could no longer continue. The wind was blowing so bad they were knocked off their feet, and the storm was clearly still raging. Due to this, they called off the search. The next day, the teams set out again, basically to the same places they had been the day before, and this time, Joe and Brad were able to reach the top of Odell's Gully. Here, they found footprints from Jeff and Hugh and decided to follow them since they felt confident they were on the right track. Conditions, though, again began to decline, so Joe and Brad got back into the Snowcat and made a call to Albert and Michael that they would be coming to get them first. However, the radio didn't crack with confirmation that they understood. Instead, they heard the chaos as Michael shouted avalanche.
Oh, no.
So Amanda and I covered a great deal of information about avalanches back in episode 8. So if you want a deep dive
to become an expert about avalanches.
Yeah. I mean, we talked for like almost an entire hour about avalanches. So if you want the deep dive on it, go listen to episode 8. But the basics is that avalanche snow is not the same as the snow that you use to make a snowman or a snowball, or even that you're shoveling off of your sidewalks and driveways. The snow heats up to a liquid-like state as it roars down the mountainside, and then as soon as it stops moving, it cools and sets like concrete. Without an avalanche beacon or other technology to help find a person's location, the way you find a person is very time-consuming and crude. The snow doesn't offer any hints of where it might be hiding a person, and to find someone buried 10 to 20 feet under the snow, avalanche probes are used to forcefully stab into the snow until you essentially feel it hit something different. Minutes matter in avalanches because there is a very high risk of suffocation, and while 15 minutes has a pretty good success rate if you are found in that time, the percentage of survival plummets as the minutes tick on. Michael and Albert were both swept up by the avalanche, and while Michael had been successful at pushing the snow away from his mouth before the snow set, and he also had an arm exposed out of the top of the snow, he still could not self-rescue, meaning he could not dig himself out. The Appalachian Mountain Club was the first on scene to respond to the avalanche, and they found Michael and immediately were able to dig him out. When Joe and Brad arrived on scene, others from the Mountain Rescue Service were arriving too with avalanche probes. They formed a line and started trying to locate Albert. It didn't take them long before someone felt the squish of a body on the left side of the avalanche field, and shovels were quickly passed out. Because of the concrete-like consistency of avalanche snow, digging a person out is extremely hard work, and many times you are chipping away at the snow rather than getting shovelfuls. To work as quickly as possible, the teams lined up and allowed 1 or 2 people to dig at a time in an all-out sprint for 30 to 40 seconds before they would step to the side and the next person would take their place and repeat the process.
So I'm going to have a random story that doesn't apply. So my sister, my brother Luke, and I were at my grandfather's house, and he lives out in the country, and we were bored. So we decided, and we found an axe. So we decided to cut down a tree. So what we ended up doing, and why it reminds me of this, is like, okay, it was hard to cut down the tree. So it's like, okay, let's try to cut it down as fast as possible. Let's take 30 seconds each to swack the tree. And that's what we did. There you go. Random story.
Did you cut it down?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then we hid the evidence.
How big was the tree?
It was probably 20 feet tall.
I mean, how big around was it?
Like a foot and a half.
Okay.
It was pretty big.
Okay.
It took a while.
Yeah.
We were out of breath.
It
was funny.
I have no doubt about that. So, yeah, so they basically did a very similar thing. So they found Albert. He was several feet under the snow, head down at an angle, and they set to clearing his face of snow. They very quickly found that he was not breathing and he had no pulse, but still they pulled him free and set him on the surface of the snow to start CPR. Once here, however, they found that he had clearly suffered blunt force trauma to the chin and neck. While they assumed he most likely had broken his neck, they still provided CPR and took him to the hospital, where he was later pronounced dead. Albert was only 28 years old. On January 25th, sometime after Jeff and Hugh crawled into what they thought would be their grave, they heard a woman's voice. At first, they thought it was their imagination, but as the voice got stronger and more assertive, they realized it was real. Cam Bradshaw, a woman who worked for the Pinkham Notch camp, was out snowshoeing recreationally. So she was there just to enjoy the day and get outside, and she came across some footprints. Having heard of the Lost Boys, she decided to follow them, which led her to their cave. Paramedic Misha Kirk was the first rescuer to reach them, and the boys were picked up by a helicopter from the New Hampshire National Guard.
The Eagles!
And taken to the hospital in Littleton, New Hampshire, where both were treated for hypothermia and frostbite. There's your eagle.
Yep, I was right the whole time.
Jeff had severe frostbite and would have his lower left leg amputated, along with the toes on his right foot and the fingers on his right hand. Both of Hugh's legs below the knee were in bad shape, and the doctors started talking about amputation pretty quickly. However, back in Philadelphia, there was a doctor who was doing some experimental procedures on frostbite victims, and when he heard about Hugh, he reached out to Hugh's parents and basically told them about his work and what his thoughts were, and asked if he provided his services free of charge if Hugh would be a test subject for his practice. Hugh's parents agreed, and he was transferred to Penn Presbyterian Medical Center in Philadelphia. Hugh's frostbite ended up being the worst case of frostbite that the doctor had ever seen, and for 2 months while Hugh was in the hospital with him, he would undergo 2 surgeries each week where they tried to slowly remove dead tissue while also rebuilding the vascular structure in his legs. The thought being that if they could restore blood flow, therefore oxygen and nutrients to the tissue, that what could be brought back to life would be. Unfortunately, the rate of cell and tissue death that Hugh was experiencing fueled his already aggressive gangrene, and the doctor just could not keep up. Hugh's legs were amputated 6 inches or 15 centimeters below the knee.
That sounds really painful. That was probably a painful treatment.
Probably.
It almost like reminds me of like chemo, where it's just like a continuous painful.
Yeah.
I mean, probably not puking, but just pain.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you're not even healing from the first surgery before you have more.
Yeah.
And 16 surgeries over 2 months.
It's a lot.
And then having your legs cut off.
He's alive, though.
So, just wait. So.
Just wait.
Just wait. After the final surgery, Hugh asked his doctor when he would be able to bike, climb, and drive again, and the doctor had to gently but firmly tell him that with the help of technology, he would be able to bike and he would be able to walk and drive again, but that he would never climb. The doctor then handed him a couple of artificial limbs and warned him not to stand with his full weight on one of them, as they couldn't hold that much weight and it would crack. Hugh began to spiral, and after about 24 hours of crying and essentially throwing a temper tantrum, he decided the doctor was wrong, and from here on out, he would not accept that he was disabled or handicapped.
Fair.
Hugh very quickly set to changing his prosthetic limbs, and 2 weeks after his amputation, he asked his parents to bring him a pair of his climbing shoes so that way he could make a foot designed to fit in them so he could climb. He made a prosthetic foot with a narrow and stiff toe, which allowed him to catch edges of rocks that a human foot would not be able to cling to. He created a foot that had titanium spikes sticking out of the foot so that way he could ice climb with ease, and he altered the prosthetic limbs to be able to make him taller and therefore able to reach hand and footholds that the average adult would not be able to reach.
Robo climber.
This very quickly allowed Hugh to essentially compete with and then surpass his able-bodied peers. Hugh learned that it was not his body that was disabled, but technology, and he set out on his way to try to fix that. He first went to Millersville University of Pennsylvania, where he earned his bachelor's degree in physics. He then went on to MIT.
Jeez. Physics is a very difficult degree.
Oh. He then went on to MIT, or the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he earned his master's in mechanical engineering, and then he went to Harvard for a PhD in biophysics.
That's interesting.
In 2008, Hugh was asked to be on a panel to determine the legitimacy behind the International Association of Athletics Federation when they decided that a South African athlete who was a
Was it the runner?
Yeah.
Runner guy.
The bilateral
something
amputee.
Pretorius or whatever his name is.
They believe that he was given a competitive edge by using the Oscar Pistorius running blades.
I do remember that.
Hugh and his colleague Roger Cram were able to determine that there was no advantage to using the running blades, and because of their work, the decision was reversed. Hugh is now an MIT professor where he also directs the biomechatronics research group and co-directs the K. Lisa Yang Center for Bionics. The focus in these groups is to figure out how technology can heighten people's rehabilitation after severe injuries, loss of limb, and even paralysis. Hugh holds many patents to different orthotics.
See, what you guys all don't know is that in my head, approximately 20 seconds ago, I was like, I bet you this guy has a bunch of patents. And then I remembered approximately 30 minutes ago that I was predicting what my lovely fiance was going to say. So then I decided to wait, and now I am rewarded. Continue.
I'm willing to bet that you've seen this guy's face.
Maybe. I'll have to look it up.
So I'll show you a picture of him right now.
Maybe.
So his patents include different orthotic and prosthetic inventions, two of which are the Rio knee, which is a computer-controlled knee, and the other is an active ankle orthosis that uses, again, computers to allow the joints to move as close to the natural way as possible. And he holds at least 28 other patents in the attempt to help people move as close to natural movement as possible with artificial limbs.
Nice.
Despite and this is a very, very broken description of like what he's doing now and the amount of change that he's trying to create. And I also want to mention that, over like 40 minutes, we've discussed how he lost his limbs, and now he's found a lot of success with bionic limbs. But this is over a course of like 40 years.
Yes.
So
is he still alive?
He is still alive, yes. And he's still doing this work, and he's still doing presentations. And some of the more recent work that he's been doing has to do with paralysis. And
there's something about those people that were born in the 50s and 60s, like Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, Bill Gates.
Mm-hmm.
They get really smart, and then they do crazy things.
They do. So despite the very clear hardships that Hugh went through, he never gave up on himself or others. And I think it's a very incredible mindset to have, to be able to essentially have this idea of what your life is going to look like and what your dreams hold, and then have those get yanked away from you, and being able to be like, okay, I'm going to do that same thing, but I'm just moving in this direction now. And
I mean, he literally went from saying that he didn't want to go to or care about high school or college to going to MIT and doing physics, which is no joke. As a mechanical engineer myself, like, physics is like serious business as far as like a specific degree. It's like getting mathematics specific degrees is very different than getting like a mechanical engineering degree, because that's when you do the specific field, it's way more in depth than the engineering degree, which just touches it. Mm-hmm. So like that's like very serious business.
Yeah, so he has earned more than a dozen different awards and grants due to his work, and he has continued to climb routes that others have never been able to succeed at, partially because he's able to control his height.
Robo climber.
Yeah.
Do you have any pictures? You should show pictures of the guy.
I will. They'll be posted to social media. So
go gadget.
Much of this determination has led him to this point. Much of this determination that has led him to this point, he credits to Albert, the rescuer who died trying to save him and Jeff. Hugh has said multiple times that he doesn't want Albert's death to be in vain, and that is why he works so hard to figure out how to provide something of substance to this world. While Hugh has found the loss of his legs to actually be a blessing and is very happy with his bionic legs, he said that he would give it all back to allow Albert to have survived. And one other thing that I wanted to bring up is the fact that, and this goes into Friday's episode too, where these both kind of like move along similar lines, but the financial side of these prosthetic limbs, these bionic limbs, and the research that goes into them, and the ability to have them, and the ability to remake them, and move forward with all of these really, really positive things that he's finding, is also very steep. So some of the things that he has created are loaned out to people. So when the people are quote unquote done with them, they need to be given back. And I think it's important to remember that, having the technology and being able to be like, yeah, this is how we make things better, because I know prosthetic limbs, especially if they don't fit correctly, can cause a lot of problems down the road for the people who need to have them. So we have a way to move forward. It's just now finding the way to fund those.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting thing about 3D printing and all the different, what I would call retail, like hobbyist tools that are now available. Like, sure, they're not going to be as strong as titanium and medical grade stuff, but they can be used to create very unique things, and then the strong things like support rods or like critical parts can be made out of the expensive materials, and then the things that are just like the shape of the leg or whatever, like the things that just take up space and don't require to bear load can be made of these other cheaper, easier to manufacture materials. And getting the cost of medical stuff down is an ever-present thing, especially in the United States.
Yes, it is.
Yay, insurance.
So that's the story of Hugh Herr. And was my word accurate?
Yeah.
Yeah. Instagram is the place that I'm most active, and so join us over there.
Make sure that you like the eagle post that she's gonna make, because every time I'm on the podcast, there's a secret post, and if you know, you know. I'll make sure she gets the right one about eagles.
I think it's just been the last one that.
Well, I'm starting a tradition.
Okay. All right, we'll do that starting now.
If you know, you know.
If you know, you know. And if you don't, catch up later. And Sam, thank you for doing this with me again.
You're welcome.
And everyone, thank you for listening. And we'll chat next time.
Bye for now.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Please take a moment to rate and subscribe from wherever you listen to Tragedy with a View. To get access to ad-free episodes, bonus content, and more, please join us on our Patreon. The link will be in the show notes. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook. And to share a story of your own, send us a Campfire Confessional email at tragedywithaview@gmail.com. We'll see you next time.